He renounced his kingdom to have an orc family. Now the entire world wants him dead. There is a kind of silence that only exists in the moment before everything changes. Not the silence of an empty room, not the silence of a forest at dawn. This is the silence of a man standing in front of a crown that should have been the greatest achievement of his life, and feeling nothing but the urge to run. Corvin Ashvile stood in the royal chamber of Valdemar Keep, candles burning low around him, the velvet cushion with the golden crown sitting at eye level on its stone pedestal. 27 years of preparation, 27 years of lessons in diplomacy, swordsmanship, taxation, law, and the art of war. 27 years of being told, every single day, that this moment was the reason he had been born. The crown was beautiful, in the way that things made entirely for power tend to be beautiful. Gold shaped like intertwined branches, studded with rubies the color of old blood. It had sat on his father's head for 30 years, on his grandfather's before that. It carried the weight of a dynasty in every engraved line. He looked at it for a long moment, then he turned, walked to the window, and jumped. Not into nothing, into a life he had already decided to choose, one that the kingdom would never understand, never forgive, and eventually decide to destroy. But that night, with the cold wind of the Ashvale Mountains cutting through his riding cloak and a horse waiting for him at the eastern gate, Corvin Ashvale was not thinking about kingdoms. He was thinking about green eyes, about a voice like gravel wrapped in silk, about a little girl with red curls who had called him Papa. For the first time 3 weeks before, so casually, as if it were the most natural word in the world, he rode east until the towers of Valdenmoor disappeared behind the tree line. He never looked back. That had been 2 years ago. The village of Thornwall sat at the very edge of where human territory bled into the borderlands. That wide, uncertain stretch of forest and hill country where no kingdom claimed authority and no clan held permanent dominion. It was the kind of place where people ended up when they had run out of places to go. Refugees, wanderers, merchants too stubborn or too poor to set up shop anywhere respectable. A handful of orcs who had left their clans for reasons they didn't discuss. A handful of humans who had left their pasts for reasons they discussed even less. It was, by any reasonable measure, the last place anyone would look for a missing prince. Corvin had built the house himself mostly. Culver had done the parts that required lifting walls into place, which, given that she stood 175 centimeters of green-skinned, black-haired former warrior, was most of the structural work. She had done it without being asked, appearing one morning with Musgar, the village blacksmith, carrying timber on her shoulder the way someone else might carry a satchel, saying nothing except, "The frame you cut is crooked on the north side. Move the post, or it will collapse before winter." It had taken Corvin 3 weeks to admit she was right about the post. It had taken him considerably longer to admit everything else. The house had 2 rooms and a loft. The loft was Pip's. She had claimed it the first time she saw it, climbing the ladder with the fearlessness of a child who had survived things no child should survive, dragging her ragdoll up by one arm and announcing with complete authority that this was her room, and anyone who disagreed could discuss it with her doll, whose name was Button and who did not negotiate. Button was, by any objective standard, a disaster of a toy. One arm was shorter than the other. The button eyes that gave her the name were mismatched. One brown, one black. The stuffing had shifted over years of being squeezed in moments of fear, giving her a lumpy silhouette that was more abstract than human. The dress she wore, stitched from rough undyed linen, had faded to a color somewhere between grey and memory. But Pip carried Button everywhere, held her against her chest when she slept, pressed her to her nose sometimes, in quiet moments, with her eyes closed, as if she were trying to smell something that had long since faded. Culver had noticed this. She noticed most things quietly, from behind those gold-amber eyes that seemed to file away every detail for later use. But she never commented on it. She simply sat with Pip sometimes, in the evenings, The massive green-skinned woman and the tiny red-haired girl, close enough to touch but not quite touching, watching the fire. The first time Corvin saw them like that, he had to step outside so they wouldn't see his face. Life in Thornwall was not easy. It was also not complicated in the ways that had been slowly killing him inside the walls of Valdenmoor Keep. There was firewood to split, a garden to tend, meals to negotiate, a process that was genuinely complex, given that Culver's taste in food ran toward things that, when she cooked them, made the entire house smell like a very determined forest had decided to fight back. There were neighbours who ranged from cautiously friendly to openly suspicious. There were village meetings where Corvin's presence as a human man, living with an orc woman and a human child, generated questions that nobody asked out loud, which somehow made the questions louder. There were cold nights when the fire was low, and Pip had climbed into the space between them in her sleep, small and warm as a hearthstone, and neither Corvin nor Culver moved, because moving would mean acknowledging the moment, and acknowledging it would require words, and neither of them had quite found the right words yet. Muzgar, who had watched all of this from behind the constant rhythmic clang of his hammer on iron, said nothing about any of it. He communicated primarily through the quality of the metal he produced. When he was pleased with you, the hinges he made for your door swung perfectly silent. When he was displeased, they squeaked. The hinges on Corvin and Culver's door had been silent for 6 months. Perrin Croft, who ran the only thing in Thornwall that could generously be called a trading post, had known who Corvin was from the 2nd month. He had gone very still behind his counter when Corvin walked in one morning, had looked at him the way a man looks at something that might be dangerous, and had then begun wiping his hands on his apron, which was already clean, and said, in a carefully neutral voice, "Right then, what can I get for you?" He had been doing that for 2 years. Every morning, clean hands wiped on a clean apron, and the conversation proceeding as if Corvin were simply a man from nowhere with no history and no price on his head, which, until the morning the riders came through, was largely true. It was Pip who found the notice first. She had been in Perrin's trading post with Corvin, sitting on the counter eating a dried apple slice, while Corvin haggled over the price of lamp oil, when she looked at the paper pinned to the post near the door and said, with the devastating clarity of a child who has just learned to read, "Papa, why does that paper have your face on it?" The trading post went very quiet. Perrin's hands moved to his apron, his fingers pressed flat against the cloth. Corvin walked to the door with the particular controlled gait of a man who has just had ice water poured down his back and has decided not to show it. The paper was new. The ink hadn't blurred yet from the morning's humidity. It bore the seal of the Royal House of Valdenmoor in the top corner, a crown of branches pressed in red wax, and below it a woodcut illustration that was not a perfect likeness, but was close enough that a man with eyes could recognize it. Wanted, Corvin Ashville, Prince of Valdenmoor. Last seen in the Eastern Borderlands, considered dangerous and mentally unsound. Reward, 500 gold crowns for information leading to capture, 1,000 gold crowns for safe return to Valdenmoor capital by order of Queen Mother Constance Ashvale and the Royal Council, mentally unsound. He almost laughed. He pulled the notice from the post, folded it without looking at it again, and put it in his coat pocket. He picked up Pip, who was watching him with that particular expression she had, not frightened yet, just calculating, measuring, deciding whether to be frightened based on his reaction. "It's nothing," he said, and his voice was steady, which was the only gift he had to give her in that moment. "Let's go home." He felt Perrin's eyes on his back the whole way to the door. Outside, the morning was cold and grey, the kind of cold that smelled like wood smoke and iron, that sat in the back of your throat and reminded you winter was not finished with you. He set Pip down on the packed earth road, and she immediately grabbed his hand, button pressed under her other arm, red curls bouncing as she skipped beside him with the absolute imperviousness to ambient tension that only very young children possess. "Papa," she said conversationally, "if the paper says you're dangerous, does that mean you're going to have an adventure?" "No," he said. "Culver says adventures always start with someone being in trouble." Culver is very wise. She also says that the difference between an adventure and a disaster is whether you survive it. He squeezed her small hand. Also, very wise. So, which one is this? He didn't answer, but he walked faster. Nee. He told Culver that evening, after Pip was in the loft. He put the folded notice on the table between them. She read it without touching it, the way she read things she didn't entirely trust, standing slightly back, arms crossed as if paper could bite. The fire behind her cast her shadow long across the floor, and in the warm amber light her green skin had the quality of deep moss, of old forest, of something patient and permanent. She read it twice. Then she looked at him. Mentally unsound, she said. Yes, you left your kingdom to live in a border village and build a crooked house and argue with me about cooking. The house is no longer crooked, and this surprises them enough to call you unsound, apparently. She unfolded her arms, which, for Culver, was roughly equivalent to someone else sitting down and taking a deep breath. She pulled the bench from under the table and sat on it, carefully, because the bench was human-made and had a complicated history with her weight, and looked at the fire. The silence lasted long enough that it became a kind of language. Corvin had learned in 2 years to let her silences finish. She was not someone who used quiet as avoidance. She used it the way a smith uses the moment before the hammer falls, to align everything correctly before the impact. "How long do we have?" she said finally, "before more come?" Not a question. "Days," he said. "A week, maybe. If the riders who posted these are moving through all the borderland villages, and if they find us, then I go back to Valdenmoor in chains, and you and Pip—" He stopped. "Say it. I don't know what they do to you, to an orc woman living with a missing prince. The Royal Council will call it abduction, enchantment. They'll need a reason for me to have left that doesn't make them look like the kind of kingdom a prince would want to escape." Culver said nothing for a moment. The fire popped. Outside, the wind pushed against the shutters with a sound like a question, repeated over and over without answer. "You never told me," she said, "why you really left." The weight of those words settled over the room like snow, slow, quiet, and cold enough to change everything beneath it. "I told you. You told me you chose us, me and Pip." She looked at him then, those gold-amber eyes holding him in place with the certainty of someone who had spent years listening to what people didn't say. "I believe that is true. I also believe it is not the whole truth." He looked at his hands on the table. They were not the hands of a prince anymore, calloused from wood-splitting and garden work, a scar across the right palm from a saw that had slipped last autumn. Working hands. His mother would not have recognized them. "There was a document," he said. "In the Royal Archives. I found it 3 weeks before my coronation." She waited. "The Duskfang Accords. Signed 14 years ago during the last Great Border War." He looked up. "The accords that ended the war." Something shifted behind her eyes, barely perceptible, the way a current shifts deep underwater. "I know the accords. There was a secret clause, not in the public record, hidden in the archives, sealed with my father's ring." He pressed his palms flat on the table. "The clause traded peace with the border clans in exchange for allowing the kingdom's border forces to raise 3 orc-adjacent settlements. Settlements with human residents. Human settlers who had been living alongside orc clans in the borderlands." He paused. "In exchange for peace, my father agreed to look the other way while his own soldiers—" "Thornvale," Culver said. The name fell between them, like a stone into still water. "You know it," he said. She reached across the table, slowly, and picked up Button, who had been sitting at the edge of the table, where Pip had left her before bed. She held the small rag doll in her massive green hands, those tusks at the corners of her jaw, catching the firelight, and she turned the doll over with a gentleness that seemed impossible from hands the size of small shields. Corvin watched her. She pulled at the hem of Button's faded linen dress, very carefully, and in the firelight, just barely visible on the interior of the dress, stitched in thread so worn it had nearly disappeared, a small symbol, a wheel with 7 spokes inside a circle, a village seal, the seal of Thornvale. I know it, Culver said again, very quietly, because I was there. Aubrey. She told him the rest of it in pieces, the way old wounds are opened. Carefully, because the scar tissue has grown thick and you have to be gentle, or you lose more than you mean to. She had been 19 when the Duskfang clan rode with the war chief's banner toward the borderlands. She had not yet understood what the orders truly meant, only that there were settlements to be cleared, that the war chief had made an agreement she was not told the details of, and that as a junior warrior of the clan, her role was not to question, but to follow. She had understood when she arrived at Thornvale. I did not... She stopped. The fire made shadows move across her face. I was not the one who gave orders. I did not harm civilians. When I understood what was being done, I stood between two of my own clanmates and a family trying to flee. Her jaw tightened. The tusks caught the light. I was disciplined for it, stripped of rank, sent back to the camp while the others finished. She set Button down on the table with extraordinary care. I left the clan 6 months later. I did not have a name for what I felt. I only knew that I could not go back to being who I was before Thornvale. That person was not someone I wanted to continue being. Corvin looked at the doll on the table, at the faded symbol barely visible in the worn hem. He thought about Pip, asleep above them, one arm curled around this doll she had carried since before she knew the word mother was a thing she no longer had. She was there, he said. She would have been 5. She survived. Someone must have carried her out. Culver's voice was very even, in the way that evenness is sometimes the only thing holding everything else together. I have thought about it many times, in the years before I found her on the road, after. She looked at him. I did not know when we took her in, not until the 3rd winter when she showed me Button and I saw the seal. I have not known how to... She stopped. Does she know? He said. No. Does she need to? The silence that followed was one of the 2 heaviest silences Corvin had ever experienced in that house. Culver sat with her hands flat on the table, very still, a massive woman suddenly bearing a weight that had nothing to do with physical mass. She needs a mother, Culver said finally. She needs to be safe. She needs... Her voice went rough at the edges, like iron with a flaw in the casting. She needs to not look at me the way the rest of the world looks at me. Corvin reached across the table and put his hand over hers. His hand covered barely 2 of her fingers. She looked at their hands for a moment. Then she looked at him. You found the document, she said. And you left before you could become the king who kept that secret. Yes, you left a kingdom to protect a truth that would destroy you. I left a kingdom, he said, because I couldn't look Pip in the eyes and be the man who let it stay buried. I didn't know yet about the seal on the doll. I didn't know Thornvale was your story, too. He paused. But I knew I couldn't be that king. And I knew that if I was going to be someone worth knowing, worth what you gave up to trust me, I had to choose who I wanted to be before the crown made the choice for me. Culver was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind had settled. The fire was burning low, and the room smelled of wood smoke and the faint bitter herb smell of the tea Culver had made, and neither of them had drunk. Above them, a floorboard creaked as Pip shifted in her sleep, and they both looked up instinctively the way parents do, that reflex that doesn't care about species or origin or the complicated architecture of how a family was assembled. They will come, she said. Yes, and when they come, what will you do? He picked up Button carefully and held the small doll in his scarred working hands. I'm going to tell them the truth, he said. All of it, every buried word of it. That will not make them leave. No, but it will mean they can't pretend anymore. He put Button down between them, facing outward, her mismatched Button eyes toward the door. And neither can we. They came 4 days later. Not assassins. Not yet. The Royal Council was more sophisticated than that, at least in the first approach. What came instead was an emissary, a man named Aldwyn Bryce, senior attaché to the Royal Council of Valdenmoor, who arrived in Thornwall on a horse that cost more than most people in the village earned in a year, wearing travelling clothes that were still somehow immaculate. He had the smooth, deliberate manner of a man who had spent his career delivering news that other people didn't want to hear, and had learned to do it in a way that made refusal seem unreasonable. He asked for Corvin by name at Perrin Croft's trading post, in a voice that carried. The village heard it, of course. Villages the size of Thornwall always heard everything. By the time Corvin walked down the road to meet Bryce, with Culver 3 steps behind him and Musgar visible in the doorway of the forge, hammer in his 3-fingered hand, watching, half the village had found reasons to be outside. Bryce looked at Culver. He was good at not reacting, but not quite good enough. "Prince Corvin," he said. "Corvin," Corvin said. "Just Corvin." "Of course." Bryce reached into his satchel and produced a sealed letter. "I carry a formal offer from Her Majesty Queen Mother Constance and the Royal Council of Valdenmoor." Corvin took the letter. He did not open it. "The offer," Bryce said, in the careful tone of a man reciting terms he personally finds distasteful, is as follows. "Your voluntary return to Valdenmoor, assumption of the throne, and formal coronation within 30 days. In exchange, the Council agrees to guarantee the safety and freedom of your—" He paused in a way that contained a great many words he had decided not to say. "Your companions. They will be permitted to relocate to any borderland territory of their choosing, provided at kingdom expense. No charges, no persecution, no royal interest in their movements thereafter." The morning smelled of forge smoke and pine sap and cold, thin winter sunlight. A dog barked somewhere down the road. Pip's voice, high and clear, floated from the direction of the house where she was playing in the yard, not yet aware that the world had arrived at her door. "That's the offer," Corvin said. "That is the offer. And if I decline?" Bryce's expression did not change, which told Corvin everything. "The Council has authorized me to say that refusal will be interpreted as evidence of the Prince's mental incapacity, enabling the Council to act in the Kingdom's interest under the emergency provisions of— They'll come with soldiers." The Council would prefer not to use that language. But yes. A pause. Yes. Culver said nothing. Corvin did not look at her, but he was acutely aware of her beside him. The warmth of her, because orcs ran hotter than humans, like having a hearth fire standing next to you. He was aware of the specific quality of her silence, which was different from ordinary silence the way a drawn sword is different from one still in its scabbard. "I'd like a day to consider," Corvin said. "Of course." Bryce's smile was practiced and empty. "I'll be at the inn." He rode away. Musgar watched him go from the forge doorway. He set the hammer down on the anvil with a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Culver and Corvin walked back to the house without speaking. That night, after Pip was asleep, Culver sat on the step outside the front door in the dark and the cold. Corvin brought her a blanket she didn't need. Orc body temperature made cold nights merely brisk rather than dangerous. But she took it anyway, which he had learned meant something different from simply keeping warm. He sat beside her, close, but not quite touching. The village was dark and still. Above them, the stars were the kind of sharp and numerous that only appeared when clouds cleared and the air had a bite to it. The kind of night sky that made the world feel very large and a single house feel very small. "Say what you're thinking," he said. "I'm thinking," she said slowly, "that a woman who spent 3 years deciding whether to trust a human man is not going to enjoy being told that she was right to be cautious." The words hit him cleanly, the way things do when they're exactly true. "I haven't agreed to anything. Not yet. I'm not going back to Valdenmoor." She was quiet. The stars burned. The blanket lay across her broad shoulders like a flag on something very large and very still. "If you stay," she said, "soldiers come." "Yes." "And if soldiers come to Thornwall, the village suffers for sheltering you." "Yes." "And Pip is not going to be separated from us." His voice was flat on this point, with the particular flatness of a decision that had already been made and required no further deliberation. That is not a negotiation I'm willing to have. Culver looked at the sky. The tusks at the corners of her jaw were pale in the starlight, and her long black hair was loose around her shoulders. She looked, Corvin thought, like something carved from the night itself, permanent and ancient and fierce, and heartbreakingly fragile in all the places she thought nobody could see. "There is a third option," she said. "Tell me. You go back. Not as a man returning in surrender, as a man returning with evidence." She turned to look at him, and her gold-amber eyes caught the starlight, which gave them a quality he still hadn't entirely gotten used to after 2 years. That faint luminosity, like embers banked deep. "The document you found, the Dusk Fang Accords clause. You go back with that, you make it public. They'll call it forgery, they'll call me mad, they'll—" "Let them." Her voice was very quiet. "You know what that document is. I know what it describes. And there is a 7-year-old girl asleep above us who carries the evidence sewn into a rag doll she has never let go of, even when she did not understand why." She paused. "The world has been allowed to keep that secret for 14 years because everyone with knowledge of it decided that surviving was more important than speaking. I am done with that calculation." He stared at her. "You would testify. I would tell what I know and what I did and what was done in the territory where I served. Yes." The word was a stone laid down with great deliberation. "I am not only Pip's mother, I am a witness, and I have been carrying that weight since before I knew either of you." The night was very still. Somewhere in the darkness an owl called once and went silent. "It will be dangerous," he said, "significantly more dangerous than the current situation." "Yes. You could lose everything, your freedom, if they decide that an orc testifying against the Crown is a political act of war. Corvin." Her voice was patient in the way of someone who has thought through every version of an argument before it was made. "I lost everything 14 years ago on a road outside Thornvale. What I have built since then is built on top of that loss. I would like it to be built on something more honest." He was quiet for a long moment. The cold settled around them like something companionable. Then he reached out and put his hand on hers, 2 fingers covered by his whole palm. "Together, then," he said. She looked at their hands. For a moment, her expression did something complicated and private, and entirely her own. Then she turned her hand over and closed her enormous fingers around his. "Together," she said. "Obviously. Did you think I was going to let you do something this stupid alone?" They told Pip in the morning. Not everything. There were things that would need to wait until she was older, until she had the language for them, until she was ready. But they told her that Corvin's family wanted him to come back to a place far away. That it was complicated, in the way that adult things were complicated. That they were going to go together and try to fix something that had been broken for a long time. Pip listened with her serious face, the one she wore when she was processing information and hadn't yet decided what to feel about it. She was sitting cross-legged on her bed with Button in her lap, and she looked from Corvin to Culver and back again with those large brown eyes that missed nothing. "Is it going to be dangerous?" she asked. "A little," Corvin said. "Probably more than a little," Culver said at the same time. Pip considered this. She looked down at Button. She smoothed the doll's faded dress with one careful finger, a gesture so habitual she likely didn't notice she was doing it. "If it's dangerous," she said, "then we should all go, because families don't split up when things are dangerous." She said this with absolute certainty, as if she were reciting a law of nature. Gravity exists, fire is hot. Families stay together when it's hard. "That's what you told me." Culver made a sound that was not quite a word. "Yes," Corvin said, "that's what we told you." "Okay, then." Pip tucked Button under her arm and stood up with the definitive air of someone who has resolved the matter. "I'm going to pack my things." She climbed down the loft ladder with the confidence of someone who had done it 1,000 times, which she had, and disappeared into the main room to find her travelling bag. Culver stared at the empty loft space for a moment. The morning light came through the small window and lay in a bar across the wooden floor, dust motes turning slowly in it. It smelled of straw and the faint soap and herb smell of Pip's things. "She is remarkable," Culver said in a low voice. "She learned that from you," Corvin said. Culver said nothing, but she did not argue. Musgar met them at the edge of the village as they prepared to leave. He had clearly been awake all night. The forge was still warm, and he was carrying something wrapped in oiled cloth under his three-fingered arm. He handed it to Corvin without ceremony. It was a copy of the document, not the original. The original Corvin had memorized, and then burned the night he fled Valdenmoor, and the copy was hidden in a place only he knew. But this was something else. A record written in Musgar's cramped, functional handwriting of every piece of metalwork he had done in the Borderlands for the past 20 years. Every commission, every client. Including, dated 14 years ago, the fabrication of hinges and door fixtures for a military barracks in the eastern Borderlands that had been constructed in the months preceding the destruction of Thornvale. Evidence. Small evidence, circumstantial evidence, but evidence placed there by a three-fingered old orc who had apparently been watching and waiting and saying nothing for a very long time. Corvin looked at him. Musgar's one good eye, the other was a scar-bisected socket, regarded him steadily. He said in his habitual shorthand, "Iron remembers." Then he walked back to his forge. Perrin Croft was standing in the doorway of his trading post. He was wiping his hands on his apron. Both hands, his full nervous gesture, repeated twice. When Corvin met his eyes, Perrin nodded once, quickly, and produced from behind the counter an envelope, which he extended across the distance with a slightly trembling arm. It was addressed in Corvin's mother's handwriting to no name at all. Just a single wax seal, a crown of branches pressed in red. He put it in his coat pocket unopened. Perrin nodded again, wiped his hands one more time, and went back to rearranging things that did not need rearranging. Bryce was waiting at the road with his horse and a small escort. When he saw the three of them, Corvin, Culver, Pip with her travelling pack and button under her arm, he went through several expressions in rapid succession before settling on one that was professionally neutral. "I see you've made a decision," he said. "I have," Corvin said. "We're coming to Valdenmoor, all of us. And I'm going to stand in front of the Royal Council and give them a choice, the same kind of choice they've been making for 14 years, between the truth and the comfortable lie." He paused. "I think they'll find, this time, that the truth is better armed." Bryce looked at Culver, at Pip, at the wrapped document under Corvin's arm, at the quiet, determined faces of three people who had clearly already had the conversation that made this moment possible. He cleared his throat. "The council authorized a peaceful return." "Then this is peaceful," Corvin said. "We're walking through the front gate." The ride to Valdenmoor took 11 days. On the 4th day, Pip asked Culver to teach her a word in the Orc language. Culver taught her Loktar and explained what it meant. Victory. But not just victory over enemies, victory over doubt, over fear, over the voice inside that says you cannot. Pip repeated it 3 times, carefully, then pressed it to her memory the way she pressed button to her chest, purposefully, like something she intended to keep. On the 7th night, when the fire was low and Bryce and his men had made their camp at a careful distance, Pip fell asleep between them again. And this time, when Culver looked at Corvin over the small sleeping form, she didn't look away first. On the 9th day it rained. The kind of rain that didn't fall so much as decided to simply exist everywhere at once, soaking into everything, cloaks and packs and the earth itself. Pip rode on Culver's shoulders to keep her dry, and Culver walked through the rain with the imperviousness of someone made from a sterner material than weather, one enormous green hand steadying Pip's ankle, the other holding both their hoods against the wind. Corvin rode alongside them and thought about what it meant to be a man walking toward the thing he had once run from, and finding, to his considerable surprise, that he was not afraid of it. Not because the fear was gone, but because the things he was walking toward were with him. Valdenmoor Keep was exactly as he had left it. That was the first thing that struck him, how entirely unchanged it was. The towers still rose above the tree line, in that particular configuration of grey stone and old ambition. The gate still bore the carved crown of branches above the arch. The cobblestone road leading up to it still ran between rows of torches that smelled of pine pitch and the particular oil mixture the keep's steward had used for as long as Corvin could remember. 27 years of his life had been shaped inside those walls. He had been a child there, a student there, a soldier in training there, a prince preparing to become a king. He had had his first genuinely important conversation about what kind of ruler he intended to be in the library at the age of 12 with a historian who had since died and taken her brutal honesty about Valdemore's history with her. He had stood at that window 2 years ago and jumped. Now he rode through the gate. The courtyard had gathered people, servants, guards, a collection of the minor nobility who had happened to be at court when word came that the prince was returning. They watched. Some of them he recognized. Most of them wore the particular expression of people who want to have a strong reaction and have been instructed, for political reasons, to wait and see what that reaction should be. His mother was at the top of the keep stairs. Constance Ashvale had not changed either, not in the way people change when they are broken or defeated. She was exactly the woman she had always been, straight-backed, silver-haired, wearing mourning colours, that Corvin was reasonably certain she had chosen today specifically because they conveyed the maximum weight of maternal suffering while remaining unimpeachably dignified. She was 61 years old and had the bearing of someone who had decided at 40 that age was a conceptual framework she was choosing not to apply to herself. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Culver, at Pip, at the travelling pack on Corvin's horse, with the oilcloth-wrapped document visible at the top. Her expression did not change. "You look well," she said to Corvin. "So do you," he said. The diplomatic pleasantry hung in the air between them, insubstantial as the pine-pitch smoke, neither of them believing it, both of them using it as a bridge across the 2 years of silence. "We need to speak privately," she said. "We will," he said, "but not before I introduce my family." He gestured at Culver, who had dismounted and was standing with the particular controlled stillness she used in situations where she was being observed and evaluated by strangers, which was different from her ordinary stillness in that it contained a very deliberate amount of held force. And at Pip, who was standing beside her, one hand holding Culver's and the other holding Button, looking up at the keep with the expression of someone encountering something enormous and not quite decided on their opinion of it yet. "This is Culver," he said, to the assembled court and his mother and the guards and every person watching from every window above. "She is my partner. And this is Pip, our daughter." He let the words settle. "They go where I go, and everything we are about to discuss in that council chamber, they have the right to hear." The courtyard was very quiet. His mother looked at Culver for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes, something careful and old, and not entirely without feeling. Then she looked at Pip. Pip, because she was Pip, met the gaze of a queen mother without flinching. She was holding Button under her arm. She gave the older woman the particular nod she used to acknowledge people she had not yet made up her mind about. Constance Ashvale's expression shifted slightly, in a way that Corvin had not seen on his mother's face since he was very young. "Come inside," she said. "All of you." "Madman." What happened in the council chamber of Valdenmoor Keep over the following 3 days was not the kind of confrontation that gets written into heroic ballads. It was slow and difficult and ugly in parts, the way any process of telling the truth about something that has been buried for 14 years tends to be. There were council members who called the document forgery. There were nobles who suggested that the Orc woman's testimony was inherently unreliable. There was one very unpleasant afternoon in which a senior councillor argued at length that the settlements destroyed under the Duskfang Accords Clause had been, legally speaking, unauthorized human communities without kingdom protection, and therefore Corvin placed the oilcloth document on the table. Culver, standing to his right, spoke for 4 hours in the deliberate, unvarnished way she had of delivering information. Without drama, without embellishment, and therefore with the weight of something that had never needed those things to be true. She described what she had seen, what she had done, what she had failed to prevent. She described the symbol on the village seal that appeared in Button's dress, which she had found 3 years after the fact on a child she had come to love without knowing, until that moment that she had any connection to the destruction of that child's first world. There was a silence in the council chamber when she finished that lasted a very long time. Pip, who had been sitting in the gallery above with Bryce's youngest guard, a young man who had been profoundly unprepared to spend an afternoon keeping a 7-year-old occupied and had responded by teaching her a card game, which she was winning, did not hear most of it. This was intentional. On the 3rd day, Queen Mother Constance called a private recess. She and Corvin sat in her solar, which smelled of dried lavender and old paper, and the particular candle wax she had always used, a smell that was, despite everything, the smell of childhood. She did not sit at her desk. She sat in the chair by the fire, which she never did in official settings, and she looked at her hands for a long time. "I did not know about the clause," she said. He looked at her. "Your father did not share it with me. I knew the accords. I knew there were settlements. I thought they were abandoned. I thought the reports of casualties were—" She stopped. I chose not to look closely, because not looking closely was easier. She was quiet for a moment. "That is not a defense. I know that." "No," he said. "It isn't." She accepted this. The fire crackled. Outside the window, somewhere in the inner courtyard, Pip's voice floated up. She was apparently explaining to someone the proper rules of the card game she had been taught, with the particular pedagogical intensity she brought to things she had recently learned. "She is extraordinary," his mother said very quietly. "Yes. And the orc woman. Culver." A pause. Culver. She said the name deliberately, with the attention of someone learning it correctly, rather than saying it simply to acknowledge it exists. She knew about the seal, and she told me, he said, when she could have kept it buried, and no one would have been the wiser. His mother looked at the fire. "What do you want from the council?" she said. "A formal acknowledgement, public, not buried in archive records. What the Duskfang clause authorized, what happened at Thornvale and the other settlements, the names of the civilians lost, and reparations to the surviving families of those settlements paid by the kingdom treasury." He paused. "And a change to the border settlement laws, so that what happened to those communities, human communities living alongside orc clans without kingdom protection, cannot be authorized again. The council will object. Some of them. The ones who objected loudest today are the ones who benefit most from keeping that part of the border policy quiet." He met her eyes. "But you know what happens to quiet things eventually when they're built on top of something rotten. They don't stay quiet. They just wait." She looked at him for a long, considering moment. Her expression was difficult to read. It always had been. Constance Ashvale had spent 30 years at court, perfecting the art of being unreadable. But there was something else there, behind the control. Something she had put in the final line of the letter she had sent him. He had read it, that first night at the inn on the road to Valdenmoor, alone by lamplight, while Culver and Pip slept. The letter had been 2 pages of formal language and political framing, and then, at the very bottom, in a different pen, in slightly smaller writing, as if added after the official draft was finished. "I have kept a candle in your window every night since you left. Your father never knew what that meant. I did." He had folded the letter and held it for a while in the lamplight, thinking about the woman who had raised him, and the things that had been left unsaid between them, and the particular ache of loving people who are very bad at showing it. He hadn't told Culver about the letter. But she had seen his face when he came back to the fire, and she had said nothing, and she had simply moved slightly, so there was more space beside her, and let him sit in the warmth without asking any questions. "I will speak to the council," his mother said finally. It was not agreement, it was not the end, but it was the beginning of a door, and a door was enough to work with. By C. The formal acknowledgement from the Royal Council of Valdenmoor came 6 weeks later. It was not everything Corvin had asked for. The reparations were smaller than they should have been. A beginning, not a resolution. The public acknowledgement was worded carefully enough that certain council members could still claim it was ambiguous. 2 senior councillors resigned in protest of what they called an unprecedented capitulation to orc-aligned political pressure, which Culver, upon hearing this, described as, at least accurate in the word, unprecedented. The border settlement protections were passed, quietly, without ceremony, buried in a package of broader border law reforms, but present. Specific language, clear boundaries, the kind of words that could be pointed to later by people who needed something to point to. It was not justice. Nothing that came 6 weeks, or 14 years, after the fact could be called justice in any clean sense of the word, but it was something other than silence. And silence, Corvin had learned, was how things like the Duskfang Accords Clause survived long enough to define the world that came after them. They did not stay in Valdenmoor. This was never a serious question. The keep was where Corvin had been born and raised and trained, and had very nearly been crowned, and it would always carry those things like water carries cold, invisibly, completely, in every part of itself. There was no version of remaining there that would not eventually become an argument about who Corvin Ashvile was supposed to be. Besides, Pip had opinions about the inn-food. They went back to Thornwall. Musgar had kept the forge running while they were gone. The house had been watched by Perrin, who had cleaned it once a week with the determination of a man who had decided this was his contribution to events he couldn't control. And it was exactly as they had left it, except that the north wall's timber had developed a new creak that would need to be looked at before winter. Pip climbed the ladder to the loft first. She sat up there for a while with Button, as she sometimes did. Corvin and Culver could hear her above them, the soft sound of her moving around, and the occasional murmur that might have been her talking to the doll or might have been her talking to herself, which in Pip's case were not always clearly different activities. Then she climbed back down. She walked to where Culver was standing at the hearth, starting a fire for the first time in 6 weeks, doing it with the particular focused attention she gave to practical tasks, as if they were small ceremonies. Pip tugged on her sleeve. Culver looked down at her. Pip held out Button. Culver looked at the doll, then at Pip. "I want you to fix her arm," Pip said. "The short one. I've been carrying her wrong because I didn't want the stitching to pull more, but I think if someone who knew what they were doing fixed it properly—" She examined the doll with critical professional seriousness. "She's been through a lot. She deserves to be fixed." Culver took Button with both hands. She held the small, worn, one short-armed doll carefully, turning her over, examining the stitching with those golden eyes that noticed everything. Her massive green fingers moved gently over the seams, feeling for where the structure had come undone. "I can fix this," she said. "It will take time to do properly." "That's okay," Pip nodded. "Things that matter take time." She said it with the certainty of a child, quoting something she has heard and decided to keep. Corvin recognized it. He had said it once, months ago, about the garden. She had been listening. Culver held the doll for a moment longer. The firelight caught the faded symbol inside the worn hem of Button's dress, the wheel with 7 spokes, barely visible now, worn almost to nothing by years of small hands. She folded the dress carefully down over the symbol. "Yes," she said, "they do. Marcinta-diu." Life in Thornwall resumed, and it was the same, and it was different, in the way that everything is different after you have looked at it from a great distance and then come back. Perrin Croft stopped wiping his hands on his apron. He still touched it sometimes, out of habit, but the compulsive, nervous repetition stopped, as if something in him that had been holding very tight finally found it was allowed to let go. Musgar forged a new hinge for the front door, unsolicited. It swung in perfect silence. He brought it over, installed it himself, and said, by way of explanation, "Old one was adequate." He paused. "This one's better." Corvin planted the north wall's creak. The wall stayed straight. Culver fixed Button's arm. It took 4 evenings of careful work by firelight. Small orc hands doing extraordinarily delicate stitching, rebalancing the stuffing and reattaching the limb with a strength of thread that was, as she pointed out to Pip, now technically the strongest part of the whole doll. Pip examined the finished work with minute attention, pressed Button's newly symmetrical arms to her nose, breathed in deeply whatever she smelled or did not smell, and then pressed her face briefly against Culver's arm. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. There were still hard things. There would always be hard things. The world outside Thornwall was still mostly the same world it had been, one that had very specific ideas about what an orc woman and a human man and a child between them meant, or didn't mean, or should be allowed to mean. The council's acknowledgement had changed some things in Valdenmoor, and very little things everywhere else. Change was slow. Change was, as Culver said, like water on stone, invisible day by day and inevitable over years. They would not see the world they were building finished. Neither of them had any illusion about that. The question was not whether the world would be finished in their lifetime. The question was whether, in their lifetime, they would plant something that grew. And there was this. On a cold evening in the winter, after their return, with the fire burning and the house smelling of Culver's determined cooking, and Pip's voice coming down from the loft where she was reading aloud to Button, who, Pip maintained, liked being read to but could not read herself due to her button eyes being decorative rather than functional, Corvin and Culver sat on the bench. Outside the front door, close enough that their shoulders touched. The village was quiet. The stars were sharp. She was not easy, Culver. She was not simple or soft or comfortable in the ways that made life require less of you. She was difficult and patient and devastating and precise, and she loved in a way that was not announced, that was built in the way she had cut timber for a stranger's crooked house and sat beside a grieving child without being asked and testified in a council chamber about the worst thing she had ever done, in a voice that did not shake, not because she was not afraid, but because she had decided that the fear was less important than the truth. She was the best person he had ever known. He was still 2 years later, slightly astonished by this fact. "Are you warm enough?" she said. "I'm fine." "You're shivering." "Slightly." She pulled him, without comment, into the warmth of her side, which was, as always, the warmth of a small hearth. He could feel her heartbeat, slower and deeper than a human heart, like a drum set to a different time signature. "Culver," he said. I'm glad I jumped out that window." She was quiet for a moment. The stars burned above Thornwall, and somewhere in the dark a night bird called once, long and low. "You rebuilt the north wall wrong," she said. "You've mentioned it. I'm going to keep mentioning it." "I know. Also, the garden beds in the east corner need to be moved before spring. The drainage is poor." "Noted. And Pip needs new boots. She's grown again. I'll ask Para." She put her arm around him, which was less like being embraced and more like being surrounded by something permanent and green and warm. "Yes," she said finally quietly into the cold night air. "I'm glad you jumped too. Some kingdoms are built in stone, with towers and walls and banners that can be seen from miles away. They last until the stone cracks, the walls fall and the banners rot in the wind. Some kingdoms are built in something harder than stone. In the choice to tell the truth when the lie is easier, in the choice to stay when leaving is safer, in the daily, unglamorous, irreplaceable work of being present for the people who need you to be present, even when you are tired, even when you are afraid, even when the world outside is telling you that what you've built is impossible and wrong and does not deserve to exist. Those kingdoms don't always look like kingdoms from the outside. They look like a small house with a north wall that needed fixing, a forge that smells of iron and wood smoke, a trading post where a man still sometimes touches his apron out of old habit. They look like two people sitting on a step in the cold, and a child's voice coming from a loft above, reading aloud to a doll with mismatched eyes and a newly fixed arm. They look to the people inside them like home. And Corvin Ashvale, who had once stood before a golden crown and felt nothing, and had jumped out a window and ridden east towards something he couldn't yet name, had learned, in a border village at the edge of a world that hadn't yet decided what it wanted to be, that the bravest thing a person can do is not to claim a kingdom. It is to build one worth living in. If Corvin's story moved you, if you've ever stood at a window of your own and wondered whether to jump, then you already know something about what it means to choose a life over a role. What would you have done? Would you have taken the crown or jumped out the window? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one. And if this story gave you something, even just for a moment, consider leaving a like, because it helps more people find stories like this one. Subscribe to Orc-Bound Tales for more epic fantasy stories that will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Because the best stories aren't about kingdoms. They're about the people brave enough to build something better. Loktar.